The oppressive heat of late June 1863 bore down on Pennsylvania like a suffocating blanket as two massive armies converged on the small town of Gettysburg. General Robert Edward Lee wiped the sweat from his brow as he studied. The map spread across his field table, the mercury already climbing past 80 degrees before noon on June 30th. The Confederate Army of Northern Virginia, 75,000 strong, moved through the Cumberland Valley like a gray tide, their wool uniforms clinging to their bodies in the mounting humidity. Lieutenant General James Longstreet observed, his men struggling with the unseasonable warmth as they marched north. The weather had been brutally hot for 3 consecutive days, and water sources along their route were running dangerously low. Confederate soldiers, many from the cooler mountain regions of Virginia and the Carolinas, found themselves gasping for breath in the thick, moisture-laden air that seemed to press down upon them with each step. Meanwhile, Major General George Gordon Meade's Army of the Potomac, numbering nearly 90,000 troops, faced similar challenges as they pursued Lee's forces northward. The Union soldiers, laden with heavy packs and equipment, left a trail of discarded gear along the dusty roads of Maryland and southern Pennsylvania. The combination of forced marches and extreme heat had already claimed dozens of men to heat exhaustion before the first shot was fired. According to historical accounts documented in the Gettysburg National Military Park archives, weather conditions during the campaign were described as unseasonably oppressive, with temperatures reaching the mid to upper 80s Fahrenheit. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain of the 20th Maine Infantry Regiment noted in his personal correspondence how the men's leather equipment had become so softened by the heat and humidity that cartridge boxes were beginning to lose their shape. The hot weather also affected the gunpowder, making it more volatile and less predictable. During firing, artillery crews found their bronze cannons almost too hot to touch by midday, requiring wet cloths to handle the equipment safely. As both armies maneuvered through the Pennsylvania countryside, the weather began to shift ominously. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, promising relief from the heat but threatening to bring new challenges. The barometric pressure dropped noticeably, causing many veterans to predict incoming storms. Cavalry scouts from both sides reported seeing lightning in the distance, though no rain had yet fallen in the immediate area. The heat had strategic implications beyond mere discomfort. Lee's invasion plan relied heavily on speed and the element of surprise, but the oppressive conditions slowed his columns considerably. Water became a critical tactical consideration, with both armies forced to plan their movements around available streams and wells. The small town of Gettysburg, situated at the convergence of 10 roads and blessed with several reliable water sources, suddenly became more than just a convenient meeting point. It became a necessity for survival. As the sun set on June 30th, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, both armies prepared for what many sensed would be a momentous confrontation. The weather forecast, read from the behavior of livestock and the thickness of the air, suggested that the coming days would bring not only battle, but also nature's own fury to the fields of Pennsylvania. Part 2. Dawn of the first day. The morning of July 1st, 1863 broke with deceptive calm, the temperature already climbing toward what would become another scorching day. Brigadier General John Buford's Union cavalry had spent the night in Gettysburg, their horses restless, in the humid air that seemed to promise a storm that never came. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the hazy atmosphere, Buford positioned his dismounted troopers along the ridges west of town, knowing that the oppressive heat would soon make their defensive positions nearly unbearable. Major General Henry Heth's Confederate division approached Gettysburg from the northwest, their gray uniforms already darkened with perspiration despite the early hour. The heat shimmered off the macadam pike, creating mirages that made accurate distance estimation difficult for both infantry and artillery. Confederate skirmishers, advancing through the morning mist that rose from the dew-soaked fields, found their vision obscured by the combination of humidity and early morning fog. When the first shots rang out west of Gettysburg around 5:30 in the morning, the weather immediately became a factor in the engagement. The heavy, moisture-laden air trapped gunpowder smoke close to the ground, creating a thick haze that reduced visibility to mere yards in some areas. Union cavalrymen firing their Spencer repeating rifles found that the accumulated smoke from rapid fire created an almost impenetrable screen, forcing them to fire blindly into the Confederate advance. As the morning progressed and reinforcements arrived from both sides, the temperature climbed relentlessly. Major General John Fulton Reynolds, commanding the Union First Corps, arrived on the field around 10 o'clock to find his men already suffering from the heat. The wool uniforms, designed for cooler climates, became torture devices in the Pennsylvania sun. Soldiers began discarding equipment at an alarming rate, leaving knapsacks, extra ammunition, and even shoes scattered across the battlefield. The Confederate advantage in numbers began to tell as more divisions arrived, but the heat affected both sides equally. Artillery batteries found their bronze cannons expanding in the heat, making accurate aiming increasingly difficult as the day wore on. Gunpowder charges, affected by the temperature and humidity, produced inconsistent results, with some rounds falling short while others flew over their intended targets. Historical records from the Gettysburg Address Research Foundation indicate that temperatures on July 1st reached 87 degrees Fahrenheit by noon, with humidity levels approaching 80%. The fighting intensified as the day progressed, with Union forces gradually falling back through the town of Gettysburg itself. The narrow streets became furnaces, trapping heat between the brick and stone buildings. Wounded soldiers left in the sun faced a dual enemy: their injuries and the merciless Pennsylvania heat that threatened to kill them faster than their wounds. By afternoon, as Confederate forces under Lieutenant General Richard Stoddert Ewell pressed their attack from the north and east, the heat had become a tactical factor. Officers on both sides found that their men could only sustain intense fighting for short periods before becoming combat ineffective due to heat exhaustion. Water details became as crucial as ammunition resupply, with both armies desperately seeking access to the few wells and streams in the area. The Union retreat through Gettysburg turned chaotic as heat-exhausted soldiers collapsed in the streets. Many Confederate pursuers, equally affected by the oppressive conditions, lacked the energy for an aggressive pursuit. This weather-induced lassitude may have prevented what could have been a complete rout of the Union forces, allowing them to reform on the high ground south of town as evening approached. As darkness finally brought some relief from the heat, both armies prepared for the continuation of what had already become one of the war's most significant battles. July 2, 1863 dawned even hotter than its predecessor, with temperatures climbing past 90 degrees before the sun reached its zenith. The air hung thick and still over the Gettysburg battlefield, creating an almost tropical atmosphere that seemed more suited to the deep South than Pennsylvania. Major General Daniel Edgar Sickles, commanding the Union Third Corps, wiped perspiration from his eyes as he surveyed his assigned position along Cemetery Ridge, the heat already making his uniform cling uncomfortably to his body. The oppressive weather conditions had forced both armies to adapt their tactical approaches overnight. General Lee, meeting with his corps commanders in the pre-dawn hours, noted how the extreme heat was affecting his men's ability to maintain extended combat operations. Lieutenant General James Longstreet expressed concerns about moving his First Corps into attack positions during the hottest part of the day, fearing that his soldiers would be exhausted before they even engaged the enemy. Water had become as precious as ammunition on both sides. Union engineers worked frantically to dig wells and improve access to existing water sources around Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill. The small streams that normally provided adequate water for the local population were being rapidly depleted by nearly 160,000 soldiers and their animals. Confederate quartermasters reported that some regiments were down to a single cup of water per man, forcing commanders to choose between hydrating their troops and maintaining their combat readiness. The heat created unexpected challenges for artillery operations on both sides. The bronze cannons absorbed so much solar radiation that gun crews had to wrap wet cloths around the barrels to prevent burns. Ammunition became unreliable as gunpowder charges expanded and contracted with the temperature fluctuations. Several Confederate batteries reported premature explosions due to overheated powder, while Union artillery found their ranges consistently short as the thick, humid air affected projectile flight. Contemporary accounts preserved in the Library of Congress describe the second day's weather as oppressively hot with air so thick it could be cut with a knife, creating conditions that significantly impacted military operations. The famous afternoon assault on the Union left flank, initiated around 4 o'clock, took place in temperatures that had climbed to a staggering 92 degrees. Confederate soldiers advancing through the wheat field in Devil's Den found themselves struggling not only against determined Union resistance, but also against an enemy they couldn't shoot, the merciless Pennsylvania sun. Many men collapsed from heat stroke before reaching the Union lines, their bodies unable to cope with the combination of physical exertion and extreme temperature. The fighting at Little Round Top became a test of endurance as much as courage. Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain's 20th Maine Infantry, defending the crucial left flank of the Union Army, found their woolen uniforms soaked through with perspiration within minutes of engaging the advancing Confederates. The rocky terrain reflected and amplified the heat, creating an almost furnace-like environment where men fought as much against dehydration as against each other. As evening approached, the heat began to affect even basic military functions. Rifles became too hot to handle comfortably, forcing soldiers to wrap their weapons in whatever cloth they could find. The metal components of equipment expanded in the heat, causing misfires and jamming that could prove fatal in combat. Both sides reported increased numbers of weapons malfunctioning due to the extreme conditions. The second day's fighting concluded with both armies having suffered not only from enemy action, but from the relentless assault of nature itself. Medical personnel on both sides treated as many cases of heat exhaustion as battle wounds, and the night brought only marginal relief as temperatures remained in the 80s well after sunset. The morning of July 3, 1863 arrived, with an ominous change in the atmospheric conditions that had plagued both armies for 3 days. Dark clouds gathered on the western horizon, their towering cumulus formations promising relief from the oppressive heat that had dominated the battlefield. The barometric pressure began dropping noticeably, causing seasoned soldiers to predict the approach of a significant weather system. General Lee, studying the darkening sky from his headquarters near the Lutheran Seminary, knew that time was running short for any decisive action. The morning hours brought a brief respite from the extreme temperatures, with readings dropping to a more manageable 82 degrees. However, the humidity remained crushingly high, creating an atmosphere so thick with moisture that distant objects wavered like mirages. Confederate Artillery Chief Colonel Edward Porter Alexander noted how the changing atmospheric pressure was affecting his guns' accuracy, requiring constant adjustments to elevation and windage as the day progressed. Lieutenant General James Longstreet, reluctantly preparing for what would become known as Pickett's Charge, observed his men with growing concern. 3 days of extreme heat had taken a severe toll on Confederate morale and physical condition. Many soldiers showed obvious signs of heat exhaustion, their faces flushed and their movements sluggish despite the slightly cooler morning temperatures. The prospect of launching a massive assault across nearly a mile of open ground in the afternoon heat filled even veteran officers with dread. The great Confederate artillery bombardment that preceded the infantry assault began around 1 o'clock in the afternoon, just as temperatures climbed back toward 90 degrees. The firing of 150 Confederate cannons created an enormous cloud of white smoke that, trapped by the heavy, humid air, formed an almost impenetrable curtain across the battlefield. Union artillery responded with equal fury, adding to the suffocating haze that reduced visibility to mere yards in some areas. Military historians at the Gettysburg Foundation have documented that the afternoon of July 3rd saw temperatures reach their peak for the entire battle, with readings of 94 degrees recorded in the shade. Major General George Edward Pickett's division, along with supporting troops totaling nearly 15,000 men, began their famous charge across the open fields toward Cemetery Ridge at approximately 3 o'clock. The combination of blazing afternoon sun and physical exertion created horrific conditions for the attacking Confederate soldiers. Men began collapsing from heat stroke before they had covered half the distance to the Union lines, their bodies simply unable to function in the extreme conditions while carrying full equipment and weapons. The thick, humid air played havoc with rifle fire on both sides. Union defenders along Cemetery Ridge found that their muskets misfired frequently as the extreme heat affected both gunpowder and metal components. Confederate attackers, gasping for breath in the oppressive atmosphere, struggled to maintain their formations as heat exhaustion claimed soldiers faster than Union bullets in some sections of the advance. The weather conditions also affected the Union response to the charge. Artillery crews manning the batteries along Cemetery Ridge worked in furnace-like conditions, with cannon barrels so hot they required constant cooling with wet rags and water. The extreme heat caused several ammunition explosions, adding to the casualties among the gun crews who were already suffering from the oppressive conditions. As Pickett's charge reached its climax at the stone wall along Cemetery Ridge, the temperature peaked at what survivors later described as unbearable levels. The fighting became hand-to-hand in some areas, with men on both sides struggling as much against heat exhaustion as against each other. The famous high water mark of the Confederacy was reached and passed in conditions that tested human endurance to its absolute limits. By 4 o'clock, as the shattered remnants of the Confederate assault retreated across the blood-soaked fields, the first drops of rain began to fall, finally breaking the oppressive heat that had dominated the battlefield for 3 days. As the defeated remnants of Pickett's charge staggered back across the corpse-strewn fields toward Confederate lines, the first fat raindrops began spattering the dust-covered ground of Gettysburg. The temperature, which had reached a suffocating 94 degrees during the height of the afternoon assault, began dropping rapidly as towering thunderheads blocked out the merciless Pennsylvania sun. General Robert Edward Lee, his face etched with the weight of defeat and exhaustion, felt the first cool breeze in 3 days as he rode among his shattered troops. The approaching storm system brought immediate relief to soldiers on both sides, who had endured 3 days of brutal heat. Confederate survivors of the Great Charge collapsed in whatever shade they could find, their gray uniforms soaked through with perspiration and their faces flushed crimson from heat exhaustion. Many men simply lay on the ground with their mouths open, trying to catch the precious raindrops that began falling with increasing frequency as the afternoon progressed. Union soldiers along Cemetery Ridge, who had spent the day fighting in conditions that one Massachusetts veteran later described as hotter than the gates of hell, welcomed the cooling rain with tears of relief. The stone walls and rocky outcroppings that had provided defensive positions had absorbed heat all day, creating furnace-like conditions that made touching any surface painful. As the rain began in earnest around 5 o'clock, steam rose from the superheated rocks and metal equipment scattered across the battlefield. The sudden change in weather conditions created new challenges for both armies. The dusty roads that had been baked hard by 3 days of extreme heat quickly turned to treacherous mud as the rain intensified. Confederate artillery, attempting to withdraw from advanced positions, found their gun carriages sinking into what had become a quagmire within minutes of the downpour beginning. Horses, already weakened by heat and dehydration, struggled to pull equipment through the rapidly deteriorating conditions. According to meteorological data compiled by the National Weather Service and referenced in Smithsonian Magazine's analysis of Civil War weather patterns, the Gettysburg area experienced a dramatic temperature drop of over 20 degrees within 2 hours as the storm system moved through. The thunderstorm that broke over Gettysburg around 6 o'clock in the evening was described by survivors as one of the most violent they had ever experienced. Lightning illuminated the battlefield in stark, horrifying detail, revealing the true cost of 3 days of fighting in the blazing heat. Thunder crashed overhead with such intensity that many soldiers, already traumatized by days of artillery bombardment, cowered in whatever shelter they could find. The rain, which had been so desperately needed by both armies, quickly became a torrent that created new problems. Wounded soldiers, left on the field during the heat of battle, found themselves in danger of drowning as low-lying areas filled with rushing water. Medical personnel from both sides worked frantically to move casualties to higher ground, often carrying men through ankle-deep mud that had been sun-baked earth just hours before. For General Lee, the violent weather change confirmed his decision to begin withdrawing his army back toward Virginia. The road south, already difficult due to the army's exhausted condition, would become nearly impassable if the rain continued. Confederate quartermasters reported that much of their remaining gunpowder had been compromised by the sudden humidity change, making continued offensive operations impossible, even if Lee had desired them. The storm system brought welcome relief to the thousands of wounded soldiers on both sides, but it also complicated rescue and medical operations. Hospital tents, hastily erected during the heat wave, proved inadequate against the driving rain and wind. Confederate field hospitals, located in the open due to the urgent need for air circulation during the hot weather, became flooded disaster areas as medical personnel struggled to protect their patients from the elements. As night fell on July 3rd, the temperature had dropped to a blessed 72 degrees, but the continuing storm made movement almost impossible for both armies. The weather that had shaped every aspect of the battle's first 3 days would continue to influence the aftermath, as both Lee's retreat and Meade's pursuit would be significantly affected by the muddy conditions created by the dramatic atmospheric change. The morning of July 4, 1863 dawned gray and cool, a stark contrast to the blazing heat that had defined the previous 3 days of fighting at Gettysburg. The temperature had plummeted to a comfortable 68 degrees, but the torrential rains of the previous evening had transformed the Pennsylvania countryside into a muddy wasteland that would prove as challenging for military operations as the oppressive heat had been. General Robert Edward Lee, surveying the changed landscape from his headquarters tent, realized that his army's retreat would be far more difficult than originally planned. The dramatic weather change had created a logistical nightmare for both armies. Roads that had been dusty and hard-packed were now rivers of mud that swallowed wagon wheels and mired artillery pieces. Confederate supply trains, attempting to begin the withdrawal toward Virginia, found themselves stuck fast in what had become an almost impassable quagmire. Teams of horses that had struggled against heat exhaustion now foundered in knee-deep mud, unable to pull their loads more than a few yards at a time. Union forces, despite their tactical victory, found themselves equally hampered by the weather conditions. Major General George Gordon Meade, under pressure from Washington to pursue and destroy Lee's retreating army, discovered that his cavalry and artillery could barely move through the transformed landscape. What should have been a rapid pursuit became a slow, frustrating crawl through muddy fields and flooded creek bottoms. The medical crisis created by 3 days of extreme heat fighting was compounded by the sudden weather change. Thousands of wounded soldiers from both sides, many suffering from heat stroke in addition to their battle injuries, now faced exposure to cold rain and flooding. Confederate field hospitals, overwhelmed and undersupplied, struggled to protect their patients from the elements. Union medical personnel worked around the clock to evacuate casualties from low-lying areas that had become temporary lakes. Historical accounts documented by the Gettysburg National Military Park indicate that the weather conditions following the battle were described by participants as the most challenging retreat conditions experienced during the entire war. The psychological impact of the weather change was as significant as its physical effects. Confederate soldiers, already demoralized by their defeat, found their spirits crushed further by the miserable conditions that made every step of their retreat a struggle. Many units simply broke down completely, with exhausted men abandoning equipment and seeking shelter wherever they could find it. Discipline, maintained despite the heat through 3 days of fighting, began to collapse under the combined weight of defeat and meteorological misery. General Lee's famous wagon train of wounded, stretching for nearly 15 miles when it finally got moving, became a nightmare of human suffering exacerbated by weather conditions. The journey that should have taken 2 days extended to more than a week as wagons became mired in mud and had to be abandoned or unloaded. Many severely wounded Confederate soldiers died not from their injuries, but from exposure to the cold rain that followed the scorching heat. The Union pursuit, hampered by the same conditions that slowed Lee's retreat, became a series of missed opportunities. Federal cavalry under Brigadier General Hugh Judson Kilpatrick found their horses foundering in the mud, unable to close with the retreating Confederates despite the enemy's obvious difficulties. Artillery pieces that had fired effectively during the hot, dry conditions of the battle now couldn't be moved from their positions without teams of men pushing and pulling them through the mire. The weather's impact extended beyond immediate military considerations to affect the very memory of the battle. Photographers attempting to document the aftermath found their equipment damaged by moisture, while correspondents struggled to get their dispatches through to newspapers in the East. The dramatic change from blazing heat to cool rain became part of the battle's mythology, with survivors on both sides remembering the relief of that first cool breeze as vividly as they recalled the sound of artillery or the sight of Pickett's charge. As both armies slowly extricated themselves from the Gettysburg area over the following days, the weather continued to play a crucial role in shaping the aftermath of what many already recognized as the war's turning point. The heat that had tested human endurance during the battle gave way to conditions that would test the Army's ability to survive and continue fighting, proving that at Gettysburg, nature had been as formidable an opponent as any human enemy on the field.